Hey everyone, so I know you guys like texture videos, so I'll create a few on different aspects of rendering realistic texture. All right, so in this one, I'll share a few tips on rendering textures in light and shadow. And as usual, thanks to everyone who supports my books, Pen and Drawing Simple Guide, and the a complimentary workbook. Also in the workbook, I do also offer some exercises on rendering texture. So there's lots of stuff here on creating patterns for your textures, as well as experimenting with different ways to vary them, as well as applying texture to forms, applying light and shadow, and so on. So that's pretty much what I'm doing in these videos. I'll do a few in which I'll just break down some basic concepts that would enable you to understand the whole idea of rendering texture in general a little bit better, because sometimes it helps to elaborate on some of the concepts that you find in a book. Now, textures are one of the most visually appealing elements to capture in pen and ink. You know, ink creates really intricate details, crisp lines, deep values, and just a rich plethora of wonderful mark making. Now, rendering textures in light and shadow can be tricky, right? So it's worth breaking it down so it's a bit easier for you to understand. And that's what I'll do with these following tips. Now, before looking at light and shadow, let's look at the most fundamental aspect of creating textures, and that's a texture's pattern. All right. Now, it's the simplest unit or the basic design motif that is repeated and creates a texture's overall feel and look. Now, every texture has one, all right, every single texture. Or the idea is it's important for you to identify that there is one or create one if you don't see it, all right? That's the key point here, that, you have to be in your a state of mind as a creative that even if you can't identify it, it's important to just create one to use. All right. So that will enable your process to be better. So there are times, for example, when I am trying to create a texture and I just can't figure out a pattern for it. And sometimes without knowing, it will stall my process. So what I'll do is I'll force myself generally to create a simple pattern of that texture I'm trying to create. Whether I feel comfortable that this is the pattern or the best pattern or not, it doesn't matter. The fact is you keep moving. So I create something that I can actually use and move forward with. Now, the key is identifying it, because identifying it enables us to manipulate the texture in different ways. All right. So the first thing you want to do is try to have an idea of what is the pattern, what is the basic unit of this texture that I'm trying to create. Now, the next important tip I usually advise my students is that you try to study the texture's behavior in light and shadow. All right. So basically, we study what happens to the texture's appearance in light and what happens to it in shadow, all right? And of course, in the transition areas as well. So we don't just make it darker. We don't just make a texture darker in shadow, all right? And just lighter in light. Well, the key question is, how do we do it? Because we want to do it in a way that still enables us to capture the essence of that texture, all right? So in shadow, for example, you ask yourself questions like, do the details become blurred? Are the values inverted? Are the pattern modified in some way? Does it appear as another texture? So in light, are the details bleached out? Are the outlines broken, and so on? You have to look for those visual cues of what, and this is why observation is so important in drawing. Drawing is about seeing, guys. All right. So it's important that you look for what happens to this texture in light. What happens as a form transitions into light, you see? So you have to look for those little details, and that is what enables you to start developing your process. So in whatever situation and whatever type of lighting condition you're confronted with, you're able, whether imagined or observed, you're able to recreate the effects of light and shadow on that pattern or on the texture. All right. So, and that's very important, because you'll find that we generally have these preconceived ideas of what happens to a texture. All right. And then we'll often just act on that. And sometimes the visual results are not what we wanted. All right. So it's important to really look at the texture and think about what happens and really try to observe what happens. All right. And then you try to recreate those visual effects in your work. And then the third tip is to try to identify your technique. So now you have looked at the pattern of the texture, you've identified the pattern, or you've created one, right? Then you look at the texture and see what happens to it in light and shadow. All right. Then what you have to do then is go into your arsenal of tricks, of techniques, of skills, your understanding of your medium. You know, in this case, of course, using pen and ink, but it's the same thing applies whether you're using graphite, pastels, charcoal, whatever the medium or media that you're using. You have to now say, okay, what are the techniques that I'm going to use to create this? No, so you know, one of the cool things about pen and ink is that there are always multiple ways of doing something, right? It's fun, and it's fun to try out different approaches to creating visual effects. So with textures in light and shadow, experiment with different types of strokes, different types of mark making, different patterns you can create, different, you know, you may find that using a bolder tip, a larger tip of your pen will actually create a different effect as opposed to using a smaller tip, or using the side of your pen, or using a brush pen may be able to capture the nuances of a texture that a regular technical pen may not be able to. All right, so you may find that you may have to use a non-conventional tool. You may have to use a toothbrush, or you may have to use the tip of your finger. You may have to use a piece of crumpled paper. You know, experiment with different ways of creating it, because sometimes it's really challenging or limiting to confine yourself to just one type of medium. So the good thing is you can, pen and ink allows you so many different ways of mark making that you can really have fun with just trying to come up with different ways to create that effect that you're going for. So like I always suggest to you in most of my videos, take the time to simplify the process, break concepts or techniques down as simple as you can, and you'll find it a lot easier to master them and to understand how to approach your drawings in a creative way. All right, so you won't be a slave to the image. You won't be a slave to whatever you're drawing. You don't have to copy it exactly as is. By being able to, like for example, in this case, you know, with rendering light and shadow, or textures in light and shadow, by understanding that, one, it's important to separate the pattern, then understand how to convey that texture in light and shadow, and then deciding on your technique by combining all those three approaches or elements or aspects. Then you have so much more control over rendering textures, not just in terms of what you see, but in terms of what you imagine. All right, and that's ultimately, I think, what every artist wants to be able to do, to visualize something in your mind and then to actually create it. All right, so all right, I hope you liked this video and you found something or some things that you can take from this to help your own drawing process. All right, thanks so much for watching, guys. Keep practicing, and I'll see you in the next video.